Good morning. Can you all hear me? Good morning and welcome. Welcome to the Maryland Center for History and Culture. My name is Katie Calgene. I am the president and CEO of this organization. And it's a busy day on campus. And we're so glad to see so many people out on a Saturday. Today is a very special occasion as we gather for our third annual Ashby M Larmore Fellowship, made possible through the generous support of the Larmore family. This fellowship was established to honor Mr. Larmore's deep passion for genealogical and historical research, particularly as it relates to Maryland's Eastern Shore. The fellowship supports scholarly work grounded in primary sources from the collections of the H. Furlong Baldwin Library, helping to advance new research and deepen our understanding of the region's deep history. To learn more about Mr. Larmore and his legacy, I encourage you to pick up a copy of his bio available over at the table to my right. Thank you all so much for being here and for supporting scholarly lectures at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. There's so much going on campus, and I encourage you to check out everything that we have going on this season. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Martina Cotto, Vice President of Research and France Merrick Director of the H. Furlong Baldwin Library. Thank you.
Thank you again for being with us today. It's an absolute pleasure to see such a full room. As our President and CEO, Katie Calgene, said, my name is Martina Cotto, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Director of the library here. In addition to myself, we have one more library team member supporting this event today. Micah Connor is with us here. Micah is our library associate and student research coordinator. And I don't think I'm exaggerating if I say that we have the best job in the world because we get to work with people like Dr. Barnett-Woods today. We get to support researchers from all over the place, Maryland, outside of Maryland, international researchers, and especially our research fellow programs. And our spring programming season is when our work comes full circle, and we're absolutely excited to be here for this today. So from the selection that usually takes place also this time of year for next year, through working with our fellows for month over the past year, this is the time of year when they get to showcase what they've done and when we get to talk about our collections. We're excited. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our third Larmore Fellow at this point. Dr. Victoria Barnett-Woods is the Associate Director for Experiential Learning and Programming at Washington College's Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience. A longtime educator, she understands the value of knowing one's own history and appreciating its applicability to the modern experience, as you will see in her lecture. As a scholar, her expertise is in the 18th century Atlantic world, with a deepening interest in the hemispheric cultural and economic ties between the colonial Americas. She studies a lot of things: material culture, gender, the literary world, and of course, piracy, as we will be learning about today. She's currently working on 2 book projects, which makes me very happy because there might be more lectures in our future as these books come out. One of them is entitled Reading the West Indies: Empire, Slavery, and the Novel. And the English major in me is very happy about that one. And it will be looking at 18th century Caribbean influence on the so-called rise of the novel. The next book project in the long is tentatively titled Intimate Empires, English Beauty Culture, and the Global Exchange in the Long 18th Century. That one will consider the intersection of ecological extraction, empire, global markets, and the intimate space of the woman's toilette. For this particular research project with our library, Dr. Barnett-Woods has looked closely into Maryland's first recorded case of piracy, as well as her own personal connections to this dynamic unfolding. So before I hand the floor over to Dr. Barnett-Woods, I just want to say that we will have a question and answer section toward the end, so please listen carefully and prepare your questions. You will have a chance to ask, and please stick with us. Enjoy. Dr. Barnett-Woods.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me here this Saturday morning. And thank you, Martina, for your kind introduction. Before I share with you what has evolved to be a truly remarkable project over these past several months, allow me to first express my gratitude to the Maryland Center for History and Culture for serving as a space where I could foster my intellectual curiosity and nurture this project to where it has arrived today. The archivists and resource librarians were indefatigable and generous with me during my time spent here, particularly as I have the propensity, like so many millennial researchers, to utter obscenities about the unintelligibility of 17th century penmanship under my breath. So institutional centers like MCHC are integral to the fabric of a vibrant society, and I've only grown in my appreciation and respect for the critical role that they serve in our local communities. So thank you to Micah and to Sandra for your archival expertise. Thank you, Martina, for helping me navigate this fellowship, and above all, to Ms. Larmore, without whose generosity I would not be standing in front of you all. So, for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to be interweaving two different stories, one of which is my own. The other is a story of a man who was executed for the crime of piracy nearly 400 years ago, a man who's been able to stretch his ghostly hands through the generations of time to complicate a narrative of Maryland's very early history. The story begins, as many stories begin, with a death of a father, my father, in 2014. It's a terrible way to start, I know, but it was his death that evoked my drive to pursue my family's genealogy. I feel that this is the case for many sons and daughters. Growing up, my father shared stories that his father told him of brother fighting brother in the Civil War, of patriots' names long forgotten, fighting for freedom during the American War of Independence, of some being the very founders of this country. Growing up in Southern California, however, legacies of a founding past didn't have the same kind of cultural currency. Of course, the retrospection that accompanies middle age tends to give that history a bit more value. Taking a deeper dive through my father's side of the family, I found the story of a nation. There was Martin Brown IV, who settled in Indiana after serving in the War of 1812, or Aaron Harlan III, who in 1790 had recently come to Lawrence, South Carolina, to buy 140 acres of land, and was accompanied by 2 sons, 4 daughters, and 1 person who was enslaved. Also in the family tree was a Leonard Calvert's, a name many Marylanders immediately recognize and connect with the founding of this state. It was only a matter of coincidence that I had moved to Maryland from California via the Philippines and Wisconsin. Long story, we'll not get into it. And an even more circuitous journey that led me to my position at Washington College's Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience. So in the summer of 2024, along with other Washington College faculty and staff, I took part in a summer study abroad trip to Northern England's Kiplin Hall estate, the ancestral home of the Calvert family built in 1625. Whilst lingering in its grand oak-paneled hallways, I overheard 2 volunteers speak in hushed tones about a descendant amongst the group. I approached and acknowledged that I may be that person of interest. One volunteer named Steph Williamson, who is now a wonderful colleague, walked up to me, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Well, do I have a bone to pick with you?" Dumbstruck, I found few words that would supply a satisfactory response. So we found a place where she could clarify a bit and air a grievance that was 400 years in the making. So on March 14th, 1637, her 11th generation ancestor, Thomas Smith, was brought to the bar for the crime of piracy, a crime for which he was found guilty and sentenced to hang by the neck till you be dead. Leonard Calvert presided over the trial, granting no last rites, as even that small clemency was not afforded to pirates. So put succinctly, it appears that my ancestor sentenced Smith, her ancestor, to death. It was, to be sure, an interesting start to our relationship. So for those who are familiar with Maryland's colonial beginnings, the trial and condemning of Thomas Smith is but one outcome branched of a much larger legal case, which involved land claims, an access point to the profitable commercial beaver trade, political allegiances, and religious fidelities. This legal dispute, that between Virginia Assemblyman and Kent Islander William Claiborne and Maryland Governor Leonard Calvert, has been researched. However, after my interaction with Ms. Williamson, it became abundantly clear that Smith was deserving of more critical scholarly attention. It was his life and his trial embroiled in this curious case of Kent Island that I centralized in my research. Given that I also studied 18th century piracy, albeit a century after Smith's trial, I was enigmatically intrigued for the crime in which he was accused and condemned. Why piracy? Indeed, as it would turn out, I was researching Maryland's very first pirate. Yet, as the circumstances of his trial were far more complicated than what previous scholars have recorded, perhaps because Smith was ancillary to this grander narrative of a Calvert victory of Kent Island miscreants. The traditional story of Maryland's colonial history is one wherein the brothers Calvert founded a land north of Virginia, charted by the most serene King Charles I, but debatable, a land which was defined by its great abundance of fish, fowl, and fur. With the Virginia colony moderately established by 1632, after violent hardships and brutal deaths caused by unusually cold winters, indigenous attacks, disease, and domestic violence, future colonial settlers were across the Atlantic taking notes. And with the dissolution of the Virginia Company in 1624, it also became clear that a colony could sustain independently of a relationship with a joint stock company. So as King Charles I granted the 1632 Charter, which established the territorial boundaries of what would be Maryland, named after his French wife, Henrietta Maria, we have, and so you'll have to follow along. So here's the map for you. We have all of that part of the peninsula between the ocean on the east and the Bay of the Chesapeake on the west, divided from the residue thereof by a right line drawn from the promontory or headland called Watkins Point. You can see it on the lower right-hand side. Situated upon the bay aforesaid, near the river Wigloo on the west, unto the main ocean on the east, and between that boundary on the south, unto that part of the Bay of the Delaware on the north, which lieth on that 40th on the 40th degree north latitude where New England is terminated, so like right up there. And all of that tract of land with the meets underwritten, that is to say, passing from the said bay called Delaware in a right line by the degree aforesaid, this is so complicated, unto the true meridian of the first fountain of the river Potomac, thence verging down south unto the further bank of that said river, and following the same west and south unto a certain place where it disembogues into the aforesaid Bay of the Chesapeake, and thence by the shortest line unto the aforesaid promontory or place called Watkins Point, so that the whole tract of land divided by the line aforesaid between the main ocean and Watkins Point, unto the promontory called Cape Charles, and all the appendages thereof, may be entirely accepted forever to us, our heir and accessors. So clear, right? But it was in the 1632 Charter. I'm cheating a little bit here because what you're seeing is the 1670 map, and I recognize that for those in the back it may be a little difficult to see, but in this 1670 map, what you can see is a little punctuated, you can see the little punctuated lines which divide Virginia and Maryland by the Potomac. So you can see that they've always been divided by the Potomac since the beginning, and you can also see that that there's always that little bit of division beginning of what they identified as Watkins Point. So that little bit of that eastern shore had always been designated as belonging to Virginia. But everything else north belonged to Maryland. So the Calverts had a significant but clearly defined swath of land, situated between a Puritan north and an Anglican south. Indeed, as the conventional story goes, Maryland has always assumed, in the word of Robert Brugger's book of that title, a middle temperament, that which threaded a needle between the north and the south, capitalistic ventures in one region and New World diasporic settlement in the other. In its intended socio-political structure, built on the jurisprudential precedents of the Massachusetts and Virginia colonies, it also meant to better balance the powers between colony and metropole, between assembly and governor. So it's against this backdrop that we commonly set the stage for the story of Kent Island and William Claiborne, the purportedly proud, impulsive, untamed, rabble-rousing, swashbuckling Virginia rebel who sat on plots against the Calverts. So the case of Kent Island, which we're going to be exploring today, is often read as the first that would challenge the Lord Baltimore's right to the sovereign charter and that which would seal his authority in the region indefinitely. Okay, so let me put the case to you now. Between 1629, when surveyors and the Lord Baltimore visited Maryland to mark out the territory that would become the charter, and 1632, when that territorial grant was given to the Calverts, Kent Island went from being uninhabited by English settlers to inhabited. That's right. Virginia Council member William Claiborne had received a license for trade on the island, which he believed at the time granted him proprietary rights as well. This had swiftly evolved to become an extraordinary, lucrative trading post with the Susquehannock tribes. Claiborne, in fact, was the one who named it Kent Island after the region he originally came from southeast of London. Before the English arrived, the island had been occupied by the Mattapeaks. There's archaeological evidence of indigenous habitation on the island for nearly 12,000 years. So as you can see, they called the island Mattapontsin. However, continuous English settlement in the early 17th century forced indigenous emigration from the site, and settle did Claiborne do. By 1631, he established a trading post with a group of his closest men. By 1634, there was a fort with a palisade, a gristmill, courthouse, trading post, and an Anglican church. By 1638, the population grew to 120 people, including women and children. This growth was a signifier of just how profitable the beaver trade was for the early colonists. It was the financial lifeline that provided isn't that a funny beaver? This growth was a signifier of just how profitable the beaver trade was for early colonists. It was the financial lifeline that provided the capital for settlers to enter the plantation economy in the Chesapeake. We are talking about tens of thousands of pelts, mostly beaver, given the European fashion demands for them, leaving the fledgling North American colonies and entering into the English markets, making a few Chesapeake men very wealthy indeed. And I'm just going to put a pause right here. Does anybody recognize these two people? Oh, yes. All right, who are we looking at? Yeah, so we're looking at King Charles I and Henrietta Maria, right? And so we're looking at King Charles I famously liked to be painted as in like hunting, and Henrietta Maria is being painted here in court with her two favorites, the court jester and her pet monkey. What I want to just acknowledge here is that they're, from what I can tell, they are both famously wearing beaver felt hats, all right? And so it's a kind of a bit of a full circle here. Sumptuary laws prevented individuals. You had to make at least 100 pounds per annum in order for you to even wear beaver. And so being able to wear beaver in England was a sign of aristocratic status. And so the fact that we have both our king and queen wearing beaver is an indicator that that was a sign of something pretty special. Of course, the popularity of beaver as the American colonies were anyway, the popularity grows over the course of the 17th century. Okay. It was a trade network from capture and kill to skinning and curing and trading that involved prodigious indigenous labor and skill in order for it to be successful, especially at the trade's beginnings. If you're interested in learning more about this snippet of early Chesapeake history, as my own research has charged me to do, I strongly recommend John C. Appleby's Fur, Fashion, and Transatlantic Trade during the 17th century. It provides an excellent entree into the larger global context for the beaver trade and its influence on this region in the colonial era. It's also worth taking a moment to critically speculate a little bit on this period between 1631 and 1634, based upon the court documents, depositions, and personal correspondence I've been reviewing here at MCHC. So from what I can tell in these records, the settlers on Kent Island didn't necessarily see themselves as part of a satellite outpost of the Virginia colony. They saw themselves as Kent Islanders. So take, for example, in one of the Admiralty Court records for November 4th, 1639, in the larger Cloberry versus Claiborne case. And I just want to make a note that this is after when Lord Baltimore legally claimed Kent Island as a part of Maryland. So in it, there's a description of this 3-year period when Claiborne found the island with his company of servants. He did not find it to be, quote, of sufficient strength or number against the Indians who were very treacherous there, and through his industry procured diverse freemen to plan the said plantation and give diverse servants the said trade and plantation. He gave reasonable wages and provided men with guns, arms, ammunition, and food. And when the territorial struggles with settlement against the Mattapeaks put the English in danger, the people did much murmur and complain to Claiborne thereof, and through his industry and care did the plantation thrive and prosper. In a document coming out of the Admiralty Court libels of January 28th the previous year, Claiborne holds firm that he had the rights of the territory of Kent under the signet of Scotland. And the whole Scotland thing, I'm still trying to figure out. I wonder if it has to do with him trading with Nova Scotia or something to that effect, what's going on with the Scotland connection. That's my journey. So on April 16th, 1638, as Claiborne himself is charged with piracy, there's a simultaneous libel suit held against the Lord Baltimore that they, the Kentish Islanders, as they were identified, were assaulted and physically hurt by pretense of a later patent granted to the Lord Baltimore. So this last point is going to be dug into a little bit more deeply momentarily. But I wanted to point out that in none of these documents did I see reference of Kent Island's relationship with Virginia. Indeed, in the depositions, court records, and accounts that I've encountered that came from the Kent Islanders, they were moderately uniform in their territorial position of the island. It was seen as quite independent and self-sufficient. Obviously obfuscated by the bluster and pomp that only 17th century aggrandizement can provide. Close readers are given a story of a paternalistic settler hero who gives his men guns, glory, and financial security in the New World. In my reading of these accounts, it smacked a little bit of the mythologizing of John Smith that we find ourselves still tending to do on occasion. But the important thing for me, and I'm still trying to figure out why it's important, is that from what I can tell, the English who arrived and made their lives, made their money, and built their Anglican church on Kent Island saw themselves as distinct from Virginia and under the naturally assumed and unquestioned governance of William Claiborne, who, as the records show, was generous to his small community and protective of it against outsiders. And so this is where we see Thomas Smith, our man Thomas Smith, appear in the record outside of the events that would get him indicted for the crime of piracy. So what you see here is a list of men who were employed upon the services on the island of Kent, including their occupation and how much they were compensated by William Claiborne. So in 1635, Thomas Smith was employed as Claiborne's storekeeper. Indeed, he worked directly under Claiborne for the island's merchandise store, which served as the centralized trading hub. You'll also note here on the right-hand side that by the time we get to 1636, Smith had left his station at the store and had moved up just a little bit on Claiborne's list of men being marked with the occupation of trader. You can also see at the very top of the page on the second page on your right-hand side, that they were in the process of building not just one, but 2 windmills on the island, indicating significant labor and resource investments for a bright and prosperous future, built for Kent Islanders by Kent Islanders. So everything seemed to be going just fine until the Calverts showed up. But it wasn't Calvert who showed up, at least not just yet. When the first Maryland settlers arrived in 1634, making landfall in what would be called St. Mary's City, settlement was priority. However, the Lord Baltimore had been made aware of Claiborne's commercial successes and real estate developments roughly 80 miles north on land which had been royally demarcated as belonging to the Maryland colony. Thus, as soon was convenient, and this is so 17th century, a firmly written letter was to be dispatched to Kent Island, stipulating that it was to be sent with someone who was comfortable with the Church of England, given Claiborne's fierce Anglican loyalties. The Calverts, as we know, were famously Catholic. The letter was to kindly, but undoubtedly, and forgive the script here, request Claiborne's audience with his lordship, there's a lot of lordships here, indicating that they have some business of importance to speak with him about, which concerns his good very much. The instructions continue that the letter should also note that his lordship intends not to do him, Claiborne, any wrong, but to show him all the love and favor that he can, and that he, Claiborne, will, like any good subject to his majesty, conform himself to his highness's gracious letters, patents granted to his lordships, whereof he may see the duplicate if he desire it. If he, Claiborne, do refuse to come unto them upon their invitation, that they let him alone for the first year, till upon notice to his lordship of his answer and behavior, they receive farther directions from his lordship, and to give an account of every particular to his lordship. So, put into modern parlance, should Claiborne refuse to meet Calvert in St. Mary's, then he was to write a thorough letter informing his lordship of all that was happening on the island, of every particular as it is phrased. Further, it was diplomatically implied in the statement that Claiborne was to thence onward be compliant with the instructions, directions, and governing authority of the Lord Baltimore. It was, to be fair, a part of the royal charter. The island was under Calvert's jurisdiction, and he was in every right to reel in, assess, and reestablish a new organizational structure. But once this letter is sent, it becomes this catalyzing spark that would ignite the chain of events, which would eventually lead to Thomas Smith's trial and execution. Leonard Calvert granted William Claiborne that 1 year of isolated leniency, with the clock starting on March 25th, 1634. Well, on March 26th, 1635, exactly a year and a day later, Claiborne sent Thomas Smith out on a pinnace, which is a small hold vessel, to trade in cotton and furs, and Calvert sent Captains Fleet and Humber to St. Mary's to intercept. So this account of the 1635 skirmish between Smith and Captains Humber and Fleet may have been the most remarkable of my findings during my time spent here at MCHC, because it is the singular document where I have Smith's deposition. I have found his account amongst the dozens of papers predominantly focused on this greater battle between Claiborne and Calvert. And though the deposition would have suffered alteration, shaped and remolded to conform to the standard legal practices of the period, it was Smith's testimony. In many of the secondary sources that I've encountered telling of this 1635 skirmish, the tone is dismissive, rather eager to skip ahead to the inevitable conclusion that would ensure Kent Island as a part of the Maryland colony. However, given that this project was designed to focus on the singular man, to hear him shouting through the pages of the past, calling for his side of the story to be heard, well, I felt compelled to give this document the attention it deserved. So as you can see, the penmanship is something left to be desired. But I was fortunate enough to enlist the efforts of MCHC Stephanie Haggis to help with it. So if you're around, Stephanie, I don't know if you're around, but thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. So once the transcription work was finished, I was able to edit it for modern intelligibility. And the story of that skirmish, for which 2 years later would land Smith the title of Maryland's first pirate, it unfurled a narrative I had never seen recorded elsewhere. From Smith's perspective, it tells a tale of men under orders by their captain who are captured, abused, and dispossessed. So while I'll not trouble you with the reading of the deposition verbatim, allow me to share a little bit of Smith's experience. So on March 26, 1635, Captain Claiborne sent Smith in the ship the Longtail to trade in cotton and furs, armed with both weapons and a copy of His Majesty's letter granting the ability to trade under the commission. On April 4th, his ship arrives at Mattapani at the head of the Patuxent just to do that. On April 5th, Calvert's men, Captains Humber and Fleet, arrived by foot as representatives of the Lord Baltimore to question Smith and the Longtail's crew. When Smith arrived to show the Majesty's letter, Captain Humber replied that it was a false copy grounded upon false information. Humber then confiscated the letter, and the Marylander crew boarded the Longtail. The only thing that Smith could do was warn the Marylanders to take care, because it was not good seizing papers that came from His Majesty. The Longtail was overtaken, and Smith and his men were forced to camp outside that night without arms, leaving us defenseless against the natives. I entreated them not to leave us without arms, and Captain Fleet replied that we were just as safe on board as we were on land. The following day, Fleet commanded that they were all to go to Maryland, St. Mary's, and speak to the governor. When they arrived, the governor was not there, so Smith and his men went to Captain Cornwallis, who was a colonial administrator and close confidant to Leonard Calvert. Cornwallis also asked for the Trading Commission, doubted its legitimacy and its trading jurisdiction, and told Smith that he would go with him to the Longtail the following day to inspect the goods. When they arrived, they found that Smith's men had again been turned ashore without any arms to defend themselves from the natives. The men were then jailed with some protection at Cornwallis's house until the governor arrived. So when Smith is presented to the governor, his account is as follows. He, Leonard Calvert, asked whether I traded for myself or for the captain, and I answered it was for the captain. I had a note that would testify the legitimacy of my trading. He told me that he would keep me prisoner to answer for it, indicating that he would get to the bottom of it. He demanded what commission I had to trade, and I shared that it was a copy of His Majesty's commission granted to Captain Claiborne. The governor told me that Claiborne's commission was not worth anything, obtained by indirect means in Virginia. Lord Baltimore intended to keep the vessel and its goods. I asked him how we should get home, and he told me that we wouldn't return to Kent, but rather would be sent to England or Catoctin, which is now modern-day Hampton, Virginia. I told him that our island was in need of corn, and he said that that was too bad. I'm just transcribing here. I offered to be under oath, and the copies were true, and that I could be examined, and he said that my oath was as good as nothing. The next day, he sent for all the goods that were on the vessels, and without any of my knowledge, and broke open a chest that was both locked and nailed shut. Once I saw that all of the goods were on shore, I asked for a certified invoice showing for the confiscation of the goods and ships. So after being in St. Mary's for 4 or 5 days, Smith begged leave to return home. Calvert allowed it, but would not provide any ship. His 3 boats were away in a cove. So Smith coordinated with the Indians, and the following day we were sent away without arms or food, but 1 gun that I had. We had 20 leagues or 70 miles to go without any means, but what we could find from the Indians. They arrived back at Kent Island a couple of weeks later, around late April. One would have a sneaking suspicion that it was around April 23rd, because that is when one of Claiborne's vessels, the Cockatrice, sent out to commandeer any vessels that belonged to Maryland, a bit of retribution for his own losses in trade, at least that's my sneaking suspicion. Shots were fired on the Pocomoke River, and 1 Marylander, William Ashmore, and 3 Kent Islanders, names that I have yet to identify, were killed. It's our first casualties in a kind of civil war fought on the Chesapeake waters. On the same river on May 10th, Thomas Smith appears back in action in another skirmish. So we know that he made his trip back from St. Mary's with no major injuries. I'm still hunting for more primary materials on this second skirmish, but in secondary sources, Smith killed 2 Marylanders and then made a run for it. It's worth emphasizing that this element of the research for me is still a bit foggy, as historic documentation may be referring to simply one battle on the Pocomoke that may have been confused into 2 separate ones due to miscommunication of dates, actors, and frankly, unintelligible 17th century penmanship. So with tensions rising between the Kent Islanders and the Marylanders over the course of the year 1636, Claiborne thought that the only authority to whom he could plead his case was the king. So he set off to England by November. A month later, Leonard Calvert appointed and sent one Captain George Evelyn to be a proxy commander of the island on behalf of the Lords Baltimore, recognizing perhaps that there was a power vacuum to be filled. In a 1638 letter to his brother, Leonard wrote that he, quote, appointed Captain Evelyn commander of the island, which formerly I purposely omitted because he, referring to Evelyn, was in general dislike amongst them. They contemned and committed many insolencies against him. The traditional accounts of early Maryland's history don't really dwell too much on this Captain Evelyn character, simply that the Calverts sent him to quell the escalating subterfuge and plotting of the Kent Islanders and that he'd failed to do so, thus bringing Leonard Calvert to military action on the island. What may be the second most significant find, aside from Smith's own deposition, is the overwhelming damning and antithetical accounts that we have of Captain Evelyn and the cruelties that he inflicted on the Kent Islanders. Now, as someone invested in thinking through a particular angle at the story, my sense of reason comports my understanding that these documents may have been biased or fabricated to construct Evelyn in as negative a light as possible. Claiborne was trying to make a case against Calvert and his representatives. However, the sheer number of varying accounts testifying of Evelyn's treatment of the islanders when he arrived in December of 1636 is quite telling. This talk is focused on Thomas Smith, so I'm not going to dwell on Evelyn too much here, but it is worth sharing a couple of things. So in an Admiralty Court record of October 1639, it is reported that when Evelyn arrived, he told the Kent Islanders that he intended to make away with goods, servants, and plantations, to transport them and to alienate the islanders and dispossess them. In a testimony by one Robert Turtle, he ordered the disposal of the ship Elizabeth and her goods, and all the proceeds belonging to him. Evelyn also sold the labor of servants for tobacco, citing that he sold Vincent Mansfield's labor to Nicholas Bright for 200 pounds of tobacco. He also did transport or caused to be transported and carried to Maryland a significant number of people off the island. For their labor, the said Evelyn hath gained at least 250 pounds. And in Claiborne's absence, Evelyn dispossessed him of his plantation on the island. So in a summative assessment of Evelyn during his time between 1636 and March of 1637, we have, quote, Evelyn's evil disposal of the goods and servants of the joint stock, and by his ill carriage and neglect in those affairs, and by reducing the island under the Marylanders, has damnified the plantation of at least 8,000 pounds, about $300,000 today. That's pretty big work for like 4 months of him being there. Evelyn's court rebuttals testify that he believed he was in his right to confiscate the goods on behalf of the Marylanders, and that Claiborne was a reckless drunkard, complaining that his lordships were Jesuitical papists conspiring against him, and that Claiborne simply found it too intolerable to be dependent upon Catholic governors and rallied his men to be as obstreperous as possible. So from my assessment, all of this is just to say that the dramatic intrigue has a bit far more texture than he simply couldn't convince the Kent Islanders. With Claiborne gone, it was in fact Thomas Smith who would step in periodically on behalf of the islanders. I saw him in the records as fighting with Evelyn about corn or lamenting about the poor quality of cotton that Evelyn was instructing the islanders to trade. So while we don't see a valiant vigilante sacrificing life and limb for the well-being of his people, we do see someone who did what he could against what he saw was a clear injustice against his community. That is until the spring of 1637, where we unfortunately begin to bring Smith's story to a close. In February of that year, Calvert received reports from Evelyn that the island was inciting rebellion against his lordship. He also heard rumors that the Indians at the head of the bay, called the Susquehanna, intended in the spring following to make war upon us at St. Mary's, and that they were encouraged much against us by Thomas Smith, who at that point had temporarily moved the trading post outside of Maryland boundaries. Deciding on military action, Baltimore took 30 choice musketeers and Captains Cornwallis and Evelyn in his company. Upon arriving, they found a vulnerability in the fort's palisades and took over the island. Smith and John Butler, Claiborne's brother-in-law, were apprehended, arrested in front of the island community. Calvert displayed the Baltimore ensign and officially declared the island as belonging to Maryland. He pardoned all the other inhabitants, excepting Butler and Smith, taking them as delinquents and prisoners back to St. Mary's. Butler was granted a pardon, but a trial was held for Smith on March 14, 1637, accused of piracy for the events of 1635, 2 years previously. But really, though, for me, I believe that it was over, even though that these were 4 events from 2 years previously, I think that Smith came to symbolize the rebel resistance of this island, right? Especially since Claiborne himself was in England at the time. Claiborne may have been the head of the operation, but I would argue that Thomas Smith was at the heart of the island. In a vote of 11 men to 1, Smith was found guilty for his felony of piracy with the sentence that, quote, "You shall be carried from hence to the place from whence you came, and thence to the place of execution, and shall be hanged by the neck till you be dead, and that all your lands, goods, and chattels shall be forfeited, saving your wife have her dower." One final twist to this story. I have not found Smith's execution records. Every secondary source I have read says that he was executed. Surely he is dead by now. But documentary evidence suggests that he did not immediately make his maker in March of 1637. That is because in April of 1638, a whole year later, we have a personal letter from Cornwallis to Governor Calvert, who writes to beg Smith's pardon. Referring to the Claiborne trial and justice being done, one of his agents, referring to Smith, now lives at your mercy for his life, which I would request to suffer for his pardon out of mere charity towards his poor wife and children. I beseech your lordship for his sake, whose honor you and we do here present, and who at last must judge with what sincerity we have discharged it, that you will not permit the least clause to bias that shall not first be thoroughly sound and resolved by wise learneds and religious divines. Perhaps it is because Cornwallis got to know Smith in that first imprisonment in 1635 and had some sympathy for the man, or perhaps Smith's actions were in this legal gray space, but Cornwallis was advocating for Smith's pardon a year after he was sentenced. If anything, it gives me the pleasure to speculate that just perhaps Smith was released. While overwhelmingly the story goes that Smith was executed, I want to see that record. So if anybody has that record, please show it to me. I want to see it. And even if it did take Calvert a full year to execute Smith, that is evidence, for me at least, of moralistic wavering. Smith's life and the life of his wife and young children weighed heavily on the governor's mind. We do know that Jane Smith and her daughter, also named Jane, stayed in Maryland past 1638. Steph Williamson, who we met at the beginning of my talk, has picked up on her ancestry from there, finding evidence of Jane marrying twice after her marriage to Smith, which does in fact indicate an execution, unfortunately. If you were to follow Steph's family tree, you'd find a great deal of her ancestry is situated in colonial North America, despite herself being very beautifully English. That alone gives you a sense of just how interconnected we are now and how our ancestors have always been crossing paths, crossing seas, and figuring out how to make a strange place a new home. And so as a point of conclusion, I just want to say that there's still work for me to do. I want to draw the connections between Smith's crime of piracy and contextual parameters of that crime in the early 17th century. I want to collaborate with Steph Moore to see if we can get Jane and Thomas Smith, two frustratingly common names, together in the primary sources as well as their daughter. I want to think more about the state-based implications of this case of Kent Island. How do the outcomes of this trial set the legal precedents for others? What model did this establish for territorial acquisition elsewhere, if at all? And above all, is this the source for Virginia-Maryland mutual antipathy? Questions. People want to know. Especially as our nation enters a pertinent year of commemoration and meaning-making, we have the opportunity to reflect and consider how the past has illuminated the path of our present. We are so privileged to have places like MCHC, which guard these precious truths, these untold stories that can help shape and reshape the way we understand our history. I appreciate you for allowing me to shed just a little bit more light on this moment of Maryland's Eastern Shore. Thank you.
Questions. As you ask your question, I will give you this microphone. You can't hear it, but it helps us record this program. So when you ask your question, please use the microphone. Vicki will pick her questions, and I will take the microphone to you. I believe we have a first candidate. Shall we start?
Please.
Okay, sorry, I wrote it down. Thank you, that was lovely.
Oh,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there other instances of someone going rogue from a colony and just setting up a new settlement without real, I don't want to say without permission, but just going rogue like Claiborne did?
Like what we have?
Yes.
That is an excellent question. I can only assume yes, because we are who we are as a wonderful country. I don't have the answer for you though. In terms of like this, in terms of the 17th century, my very narrowed focus was really here. But within the context of Kent Island and within Maryland's Eastern Shore and within the context of the expanding relationship between Virginia and Maryland, I don't have records of that within the region. But I mean, as we're thinking about like the larger colonial settlement and expansion, I mean, I would have to say yes, but who and when, I don't know. That's a great question, though. Is there something that you're thinking about in mind?
I mean, just who decided I'm just going to go start my own little town here on Kent Island? Like it just,
Yeah.
It's kind of gutsy.
Yeah, it is super gutsy. But so Claiborne had what he thought was a document that legitimized his settlement on Kent Island, right? And he saw the economic opportunity, right? So he saw that that Kent Island. I mean, when we think about within the context now, Kent Island doesn't have this. We operate through our transportation and our sense of economic. Our economic connections are through land, but in the 17th century, it was water, right? So Kent Island was a central location. It was an ideal location to trade between the northern regions, which is where the Susquehanna were coming from, and the southern ports. It was also an opportunity for folks to think about trading through the New England territories. So I think Claiborne was just thinking, this is advantageous for me to do, and he thought that the commission granted him that right.
But who the king?
Yeah. So the King's Commission. But it was for trade. It was also the Signet of Scotland. There's also this element of the Signet of Scotland, which I'm also trying to think, like, that Signet of Scotland is like, what's going on with the Signet of Scotland? Why is that, right? And so there is a lot of tenacity that is happening with Claiborne here, right? He also was in the position of assemblyman, so there was some socioeconomic status that was happening there as well. So and it seems like too, he also had the wherewithal and the position, and I guess I'm trying to avoid using millennial vernacular, but he had the guts of a leader to like go off and employ a bunch of his guys to like, hey, let's go settle this island. It's also worth noting, and I didn't mention it here, that there were Dutch settlers on Kent Island before the English arrived. And they did not survive. So there was an attempt at Dutch settlement that didn't make it. And so there was an attempt at European colonization before the English were there. And so there was a hint of potential occupation on the island before the English showed up.
Is there another question? Maybe you had your hand up?
What was Claiborne's history or position before he received that document from Charles I?
Yeah, so he was a Virginia assemblyman, and he was born in Kent, or he was born in England, and he came as a part of the larger Virginia Assembly, and it was through that position that he moved to that he was able to colonize Kent Island. But he was an Englishman. Is that what you're asking?
No, I recognize that. I think I've got it. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, sure.
You call the questions.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering, do you, maybe I missed it and you said it, but do you sense that Claiborne knew he was overplaying his hand a little bit? Do you think he had that inside of him? And do you think that he knew this wouldn't last and he was playing it for all it was worth, basically, while he could do it?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think that he believed that he had a fighting chance, which is why he went to England. I think if he didn't believe that he didn't have a shot at holding Kent Island, he wouldn't have bothered going to the king. So I think the fact that he's in that initial letter that Calvert wrote to Claiborne saying, if you don't come to us, we'll grant you that year of leniency, Claiborne didn't bother, you know? And so I think that kind of act of disregard for the Calvert's authority is what, that certainly incites a sense of injustice on behalf of Calvert's. That was royally demarcated for the Calverts, right? And so Calvert so blatantly disregarding that was seen as, was disrespectful to the royal authority. I think that kind of, that initiates, I think, that certainly does initiate the violent tension between the two groups. But I also think that Claiborne thought that he had a chance. So, and there was so much money to be made. There was so much money on the line. Got to fight for it. Maybe one more, please. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for your lecture. I've just got a couple of comments and a question. One thing I found very interesting is that Claiborne and his settlers did not think of themselves as Virginians, but as Kent Islanders. Now, I found very interesting.
Yeah.
The other thing, too, is from your lecture, it sounds like that poor Mr. Smith was scapegoated because Leonard couldn't get his hands on Claiborne. Another thing, what I'm really would like to know more about is that you mentioned a potential or a possible Dutch settlement on. That's very interesting because at the same time, there is the settlement at Zwanendale on the at Cape Henlopen, which is where Lewis is now today. Lewis, Delaware is. The 1631 that was settled about almost a year before the charter was issued. And that, by the way, is part of the grounds that Augustine Herman used that would ultimately take what is now the state of Delaware away from what the state of Maryland. With that conflicted with the because initially along the west coast or the west bank of the Delaware Bay and River was Dutch, or there was that short-lived Dutch settlement. And I find it interesting, that you say this settlement was wiped out by Native Americans. That is the same fate that happened to the the Freeze's settlement. Is a platoon ship that was granted to him. That's also the same fate that happened to the Dutch at Cape Henlopen.
So the reference that I have to the Dutch is the 1638 letter that Leonard writes to Cecil, where he mentions specifically that that Kent Island of Matapawsin, which he refers to it as such, first had the Dutch settlement. So it's worth going back to that letter to see.
Yeah, I just wonder if maybe he got his places.
Maybe.
That Maryland claimed confused. That's all.
That is very possible. That is very possible. But he also cites the Mattapique specifically. So it may be worth going back to and thinking through. Did you have it? Was there another question in there or no? Oh, okay.
I just found it very interesting.
Just one quick thing. One of the things that I did not include here that I wanted to talk about in more detail was about piracy. And so, and the kind of legal implications for that. I recognize, though, that it is 12 o'clock and food is waiting. So, without much further ado, let's go eat. Thank you very much.
Not just yet. No, thank you so much, Dr. Barnett-Woods, for this incredible lecture. We hope to continue the conversation over food in just outside of this space. We also invite you to stay with us a little longer today if you have the time, because we're open, so you're free to explore our galleries. We actually have a completely new space geared toward youth and family learners that we hope you come back to explore time and time again with the younger folks in your family, because it's meant to be intergenerational. I was listening to you, Vicki, talk, and as soon as I saw the deposition document, I believe I remembered the cursing and the frustration that happened in the library as you were looking at that. So I'm happy that we were able to assist with the transcription. Sometimes that's what needs to happen for a lecture like this to result, right? Also, I'm going to be a little selfish and say that we have our first Larmore Fellow here today in the audience. So William Kelly is here with us. Not only was he our inaugural Larmore Fellow, he's now the book reviews editor for the Maryland Historical Magazine and also employed at the Maryland State Archives. We were able to lure him from Nebraska to Maryland. So we're building a community here around this fellowship, and we're very grateful to Ms. Catherine Larmore for enabling this to happen. If you feel moved by today's lecture and you're not a member of MCHC today, we hope you do consider becoming a member so you can come back again and again and get a few more benefits attached to your membership. This talk, as I mentioned before, has been recorded and will be available on MCHC's website and our YouTube channel. So if you're registered, you should be receiving a link for it once it's edited and available. It would also air in some local public channels that you can talk to us about during the break if you like. But thank you so much for supporting our program today and for being here today. Please join us outside.